Yep.
My name is Cam Scott. I'm a member of the Communist Party of Canada, and I am a writer, poet, an art worker, and an independent researcher into populism and matters of pressing concern for left today.
All right, we got Cam Scott on the show. Cam wrote a wonderful article called The Perils of Left Populism, and this was published in Canadian Dimension. I'll leave a link to this article in the show notes. This article was responding to a different article, a recent piece for The Breach entitled What the Left Can Learn from the Freedom Convoy, and that was written by writer and organizer Emma Jackson. So I guess to start things out, Cam, thank you so much for sitting down with me and hanging out. Thank you for this article that you've written. I feel like there's a lot of value to this article because it seems like a lot of leftists I've been noticing are kind of conflating the concepts of a people's movement with a populist movement. And so I wonder, you mentioned towards the beginning of your article that populism has a proven and effective framework and electoral strategy throughout Europe and Latin America. But could you tell us why it remains difficult to apply those lessons in North America?
For sure. And I'm happy to start with this point because the most compelling criticisms that I've received have been on behalf of these populist currents around the world, typically in Latin America and Southern Europe, say, where popular coalitions have demonstrably unified a range of interests, I think, from the socialist to center left for the purposes of electoral politics. And these coalitions have occasionally wielded power with some success, until the CIA parachutes in. I think of Allende in Chile, it's right in the name, popular unity. I know people have high hopes for Chile today on the basis of a similarly broad coalition in which communists are even represented. But there was a vibrant left ferment preceding Allende's coalition, which was activated for specifically electoral purposes. People will describe the Bolivarian revolution in similar terms. That's a bit of a different story, I think, maybe not so tenuously coalitional and quite stridently socialist, and Chavez rejects the term populism. Anyway, these are inspiring sequences that I want to be accountable to. So let's call these currents actually existing democratic socialism.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
These electoral fronts that are formed out of, broad anti-imperialist sentiment are really in direct opposition to neoliberal economic reforms. IMF imposed austerity regimes and so on. These are really, to my thinking, neo-colonial situations. We're a latently nationalist posit, like the people is on one hand less immediately contradictory than here in the imperial core, where it tends to serve a settler bourgeoisie.
Right.
It's a floating signifier, right? So it doesn't have the same referent from situation to situation. So on one hand, I would say the objective conditions aren't the same. If you look at the efficacy of populism in Latin America, perhaps the objective conditions here just aren't the same. It's not the same referent. If we presume that populism is a mass politics, the political character of the masses in an underdeveloped, decolonizing peripheral state or what have you is just going to be different than the political character of the masses in an advanced capitalist country. And I said a little glibly, maybe, in my essay, that these coalitions are difficult to imagine here because there are no leftist parties to coalesce in the first place, And a couple of helpful readers pointed out that something in Canada, like, in French, Canada, a little contentious, Québec solidaire could be at least one example of a recent attempt. I don't know a lot about that, admittedly. But to stick to English-speaking Canada, there's the NDP, which has its roots in the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, which was a kind of indirectly Fabian socialist party at the outset. The closest thing Canada has had to a social democratic party, but it's long since become a centrist party. It's really incomparable at every moment of its history to anything like global social democracy. So things are worse in the US, with the two-party system. In both cases, I think that there's people who imagine sporadically electing progressives to do their bidding. But not only are there no true socialist or even social democratic parties in parliament here, Canadian leftists who invoke this model are making this leap. We're not even talking about coalitions between left parties presently existing. They're imagining that individuals could voluntaristically repopulate the NDP, for one example, Whereas the Latin American examples that I can think of, and in Greece, these examples are really, they're parties of parties who combine to form an electoral majority. So, I could stop there, but I guess the last thing I would say is that I do also think, that populism is sort of necessarily in this form that I'm describing electoral. It tends to these electoral coalitions, and that's a larger thesis maybe, but I'd offer that populism is a formalism. It presumes to gather individual interests under a unitary sign. So it is in some respects homologous with the form of liberal democracy, where individual interests seek official representation to the state,
Sure.
So for me, the limitations of populism as a concept are actually quite similar to the limitations of parliamentarism as a politics. Both replace class rule with a politics of basically improper representation. And different things are being represented here by different strategies than in what we might call the global South.
Yeah, my comment on all this stuff might be a little obvious to state, but usually there's a party within electoral systems or like governments that is organized on behalf of labor, right? Like in the UK, they just call this the Labor Party. Within the United States, there is no such party. And like I know that we have probably some listeners who are fans of people like AOC and other progressives, and but labor occupies a similar position within the parliamentary structure of the United States, in that labor has been relegated to a sort of like marginalized role, similarly to what the progressives have, right? They don't really have any control. They don't have a majority. They have some leverage, but like, I don't even think labor has that leverage. So you're very, correct. And it's astute of you to point out that like populism probably succeeds or has a tendency to be more successful or have better achievements or further, sort of progress within systems that actually have like a party set up for that sort of thing. And that makes a lot of sense. But there's also there's a lot of this entire movement that like I think that like we have to discuss kind of the metrics of what we're gauging for like the success that, or whatever whatever the trucker convoy has achieved right now. We have to kind of examine the metrics of how we're measuring that, because like, are we really? I mean, these people have the support of the status quo, right? We have cops making TikTok videos and shit like that, right? So like, it's like, how are we? Can we just, I don't know, be mindful and try to remember that like when we have labor movements and leftist people's movements, whatever, not only does it like get opposed directly by standing armies of police officers, right, but like there's the CIA that parachutes in and shit like that, and there's all sorts of bourgeois opposition to this, right? So I understand that on the left we can get a little bit, it's a little depressing sometimes to think of like the lack of progress we've made in some movements, but we have to keep in mind that like, if there is a disparity between the perceived achievements of populist movements or far-right movements or what have you, we have to keep in mind that, they have the support of the bourgeois, of the status quo, of reactionaries, of things like that. So, yeah, I think you're very, correct. And it's an astute observation to point out that like, yeah, these populism has had some success, but it has been within, situations and conditions that actually have a party to go with that as well. So before we really dig into stuff, is I'd like to talk to you about, some of the scholars you've mentioned, like Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe. But could you possibly maybe define populism, or as you see it? And would you consider, I mean, maybe it's an obvious question, but would you consider the trucker convoy a populist movement?
Sure. Yeah, and the definition I'll offer will probably hew pretty closely to Laclau and Mouffe and anticipate what we might want to say about them. I think populism can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, which is the
Sure.
point, I suppose. But for the purposes of my argument, and to be a little more exacting, I think of populism as a politics. Let's say not as a politics as such. I think it's a style of politics. So it's pretty formally empty or indeterminate. Populism is a discourse of the people, but it doesn't really refer to any people in particular. So different versions of populism raise different and often contradictory causes to the universal standing of the people, usually symbolizing unity by reference to a common enemy or other or some phantasm,
Mm-hmm.
So would I consider the Freedom Convoy to be populist? Yeah, definitionally, yes. I think at bottom, it's a group of very self-interested people who have been collected together by a common resentment of vaccine mandates on the face of it, but mandates are already basically a cipher for all kinds of other projects and prejudices that you see at work here. So to take them at their word, they're mobilizing against urban elites, Justin Trudeau, who they see as a kind of globalist technocrat, ergo communist. This is not true, I can assure everybody. We on the left in Canada loathe Trudeau with some precision, I think. But this is an important thing about populism. Not only does it create a group from very many mercenary interests by reference to a common enemy, this process of group creation essentially synonymizes their entire opposition so that any excluded element can stand for any other. And this is the operation, I think, by which right-wing populism proceeds. It tends to substitute racial epithets for entire systems. I think that's why so many conspiracy theories take on an anti-Semitic dimension, things like this, because it renders all of these kind of hazy signifiers that this populist, this sort of populist group formation would oppose interchangeable. So I think what makes the convoy really paradigmatically populist is that the people it stands for are really a private interest raised to an improper universal signification. They don't stand for the working class as a whole. They don't stand for their industry as a whole. I don't even like to refer to it as the trucker convoy. I call it Freedom Convoy, scare quotes implied, because most of the organizers and bankrollers are industry outsiders from the far right. They're from the Wexit Party. They are active white supremacists, former state police. They're not truckers. So it's an entirely improper representation, which I would offer is another characteristic of populism.
I was just I don't know, surfing through Twitter notifications and stuff, right? And I had seen that there are people that are pointing out individual videos of I don't know, that these truckers are not all just cis white men. They're minorities, they're whatever, right? And so one of the videos that people keep pointing to as evidence that that the trucker convoy, and again, scare quotes on that, right? Trucker convoy, are not racist or are not bigots is that, like, here, clearly there's, in this video, there's a person with the Confederate flag and he was bullied out of this whole thing. And I'm like, well, it seems like if you do any research on this, the core organizers of this debacle are white nationalists that seem to be organizing in order to like spread their reach under different signifiers. At their core of the group, the organizers are white nationalists or far right actors. And so given that the core is made up of this central sort of toxicity, it doesn't surprise me that there would be a person there with a Nazi flag or a Confederate flag. And it also doesn't surprise me that like there are videos of people within this group of people chasing these people out, but I would expect to see quite a bit more of those since the actual central core is inherently reactionary and far right and trying to spread their reach and trying to so it's like, yeah, that doesn't surprise me, and that seems totally logical, and I would expect more of those videos to happen simply because the center of this group are comprised of far right extremists. So I wonder, I would expect see more of those videos. But your article and the one written by Emma Jackson, y'all both mentioned like Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, which I thought was really cool of you both to mention. But maybe you can explain why or how populism, as we've defined it and understand it, like why is populism always in danger of backsliding into something closer to bourgeois nationalism or maybe like conspiratorial fervor?
Yeah, for sure. So Laclau and Mouffe are probably the most rigorous theorists of populist form.
Yeah.
Though I certainly disagree with their rejection of Marxism on the grounds of class essentialism, and a lot of my problems with populism and their articulation of populism probably proceed from my own Marxism, but I want to take their definition of populism seriously if I'm proposing to scrap it as a name for radical politics, so in her last book, For a Left Populism, I think it's called, something like that. It's a slim little monograph. Mouffe talks about how populism serves the interest of a selective group under the sign of the people. The definite article is important. Right. Constructing a frontier is the word she uses between us and them and the people and the oligarchy. Those are the terms that she supplies. But this process of group formation, as Mouffe describes, doesn't have any content as such. So populist politics is almost, let me think. Populist politics is like almost definitionally culture war because it produces opposition within the ideological field, which is to say the range of available signifiers in a given vernacular, which has a class character already, So when as Marxists we talk about the class society, we are not forging a provisional opposition in words. We're referring to an objective, even logical contradiction between class interests that actually structures the political field. And as materialists, we might assert that this contradiction actually exists separate of its historical names.
Right.
It's not a discursive production. So the kind of formalism that Laclau and Mouffe are describing might coincidentally align with real contradictions in the organization of the world. That could happen. You could try to force this axiomatically by reference to some political standard that you couldn't deduce from populist form. But the potency of populism quite actually has to do with the fact that it recruits from the dominant culture. All of its terms are produced within the superstructure of capitalist society. So these terms, especially at their most intuitive or persuasive, tend to duplicate bourgeois ideology which typically gathers people under the sign of race or nation or some other really potent signifier, in order to obscure class contradictions. So even in its emptiness, it's quite literally prejudicial. It's drawing upon these popular prejudices for its power. So Mouffe herself describes the really strong libidinal appeal of vulgar nationalism, and she counsels the left to use this to its benefit. But we see patriotic socialists championing that approach today. I think it's extremely cynical and risky to recruit from people's identification with bourgeois symbology, because it works against class interest in every instance. You can form very tenuously unified groups on this basis, but you're preserving within those formations the real contradictions of the class society.
Yeah, we had an episode a while back with a friend of mine from the Acid Horizon podcast, Matthew Lowry. And in that conversation, we were talking about the philosophy of Carl Schmitt. We were investigating fascism and far right thinkers and stuff like that. But the topic of Laclau and Mouffe came up. And I think he pointed out something that's like, the right is far better at using populism to its advantage than the left. Historically, it's just proven, and so to even think that we would be, I don't know, like considering utilizing similar tactics is dubious at best. Like it's kind of a weird thing to think, and like you said, like they. Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau represent a sort of break, like an actual like formal break with Marxism, and they do, obviously they the foremost scholars on like populism. So it's when investigating Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau, I'm a little as a Marxist, I'm a little skeptical, and like you said, you're trying to take it seriously so that way you can like refute it properly, and I get that too. So yeah, it's interesting to think that like, even within the article that you're responding to, this person is quoting, Chantal Mouffe, but also just suggesting kind of the same, that we should use these similar tactics, use these similar tools. But there are objective reasons, like we've mentioned with the when we talked about the metrics we use to gauge the achievements of movements. There are things that work in favor of populism on the right than there is on the left. Namely the status quo, standing armies of cops, and all that stuff, right? So another thing you mentioned, though, and I think you had mentioned this a little earlier in the conversation, but I'm curious if you could speak a little more about how populism is based on a sort of liberal axiom of highly individual interests.
Yeah. So again, for Laclau, populism basically works by establishing an equivalency between a plurality of demands, again, by reference to a common enemy or an excluded element. And this on its own is fine. This is a fine, true insight into group and identity formation, I think. And in this description, the more radical or democratic character of populism, as counseled by the left, is the result of more and more demands entering into equivalence. That's the word that they use. So migrant rights, queer liberation, like you name a progressive cause, and Mouffe has probably paid lip service to it in a more or less unmediated laundry list of like so-called identitarian issues that Marxism apparently can't address. I'm not super impressed by that aspect of her thought, and I'm not sure that that laundry list suffices for solidarity, really. But this populist account of basically additive resentment It reifies all of the discrete issues that it wants to organize, would be my strong contention. This account of group formation presupposes a range of mercenary interests, optimizing individuals, and so on, waiting to be enrolled in a cause. So it's kind of a stakeholder politics, if I wanted to be a little cute. And this is basically upside down by a materialist standard, which would suggest that there's some common basis in reality for all of these seemingly separate issues. If you think of how mechanically a lot of socialists treated the topic of like race and class, more so some years ago, that was around the 2016 Democratic primaries, that was this hotly contested thing, race versus class, as if these were issues that had to be introduced to each other, when in fact each term is intricately mediated in the other. Like go back to the Freedom Convoy, the anti-mandate movement, whatever you want to call it. It seems impressively chaotic. But like Emma Jackson says, what everyone is welcome there. I think that's
right. Something like
but really there's a subtending class interest that accounts for this eclecticism. It's a mobile business lobby, never mind its wealthy backers. It isn't really that all of these separate interests have converged, but those separate interests may themselves be derived from some fairly objective determinations.
Yeah. So I think it's funny how you mentioned that this is kind of an upside down thing, and I guess what I mean by that is, and it's going a little off script from our questions that I prepared, but it occurs to me that like when Marx wrote Capital, or when Marx wrote the Manifesto, or in listening to some Isaiah Berlin lectures, he was talking about the impact of Marx on the 19th century, and he mentions that like Marx didn't construct a people. As a materialist, he found an already existing people, and he gave them like a manual. So that really like compelled, that was an interesting thought, and I chewed on that for a little bit and listening to this Isaiah Berlin lecture. But I bring that up here because you mentioned in your article that populism constructs a people, and that makes sense given what we've said is populism definitionally, right? Like it takes all these different previously unsorted signs and kind of unites them under a single sort of rubric or moniker, but it creates like an equivalency of common demands and fuels off the sort of resentment, which requires an enemy. So it does this sort of cleavage thing between us and them. But really, like heretofore, these people and their grievances were not like collective. They were not unified. They were not, but perhaps within the variety of signifiers that all these people attach to, perhaps within the ultimate individuality of each of these respective individual grievances, this can also lend a certain fragility to the overall movement. So I wonder, like in my mind, one of the thought experiments I've been having in the last couple of days is like, let's say Trudeau just says, all right, no mandate. He just gets rid of it, right? Would this movement sort of fall apart, do you think? Or what I'm trying to get to is that, like, if we are going to take the suggestion of using populism on the left seriously, do you think that it is stable enough to even work towards a left accomplishment? Or do you think that, like, maybe, I don't know, the master signifier might be accomplished and the whole movement falls apart, kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that this is something I puzzled over a lot with reference to the People's Party of Canada, which is a pretty far right party that was sort of a single issue anti-immigration party for the first few years of its existence. I think it only formed in 2018, and then became, a major attractor for anti-vaxxers, anti-mandate people. They really grew their ranks very suddenly with reference to this hot button issue. So what would happen? What will happen? I wish to say that what will happen on the other side of this issue, on the other side of COVID-19, on the other side of some of these measures to manage a pandemic that is constantly, metamorphosing. I would wager that it's because the right has really effectively seized upon this resentment, which is not in itself without merit. The right has really effectively seized upon this moment to mobilize a lot of its the forces that had been amassing over years preceding the pandemic around all kinds of other pet issues.
Right.
I think that that's really the test of this movement, movement, I should say.
Lots of scare quotes skeptical in this conversation.
Yeah.
Listeners can't see them the whole time, but we're doing, rabbit ear fingers this whole time. We're just going to hold them up in perpetuity here. Yeah.
Like what is the true content of this movement? I think that will become more apparent, when some of these mandates fall away. Several provinces are lifting them altogether, probably in response to these demonstrations. And I think that what we'll see very quickly is that this is a floating signifier. That this is a floating signifier in which is condensed a lot of petty bourgeois resentments, a lot of phantasms from which the right has always recruited. This is a terribly momentary phase of a right-wing movement that has been slowly but surely growing its ranks for many years, which is why I think that the people who reduce this to its manifest content and say, oh, well, we should hear them out on the mandates, are entirely missing the point. They're entirely missing the point. It's hidden in plain sight. This is the crest of a movement that, in fact, precedes COVID-19 and has deep organizational roots in the Canadian right.
I think that you had mentioned how like the yellow vest movement had kind of like all become anti-vax or anti-mandate people now, right?
And I know Jackson talks about that too.
Cool. Yeah. I just bring that up to say that like this floating signifier, it really appears to me to be like reminiscent of some characteristics of fascism, in that like the enemy can be anything you require in that situation in the moment, like it can be simultaneously weak and despisable and inconsequential, but also be strong and powerful and of importance, right? So like in the way that the yellow vest movement has now moved over to being like anti-mandate, anti-vax stuff, the signifier has seamlessly switched in order to continue that movement because of the politics of resentment, which obviously requires something to be resentful towards, right? And if you solve that problem immediately, there is this danger of like, things falling apart, the movement disintegrating at that point. And so that signifier has to shift. And so you're right when like people say, hey, we should examine the anti-mandate stuff and take these demands seriously. It's like, okay, well, what about the next demand after that, And originally, like the yellow vest stuff was organized around, what was it, like fuel prices in France or something, there was an increase in fuel prices, and then all of a sudden everybody revolted. And I think everybody on the left, man, we were looking at scenes online out of like Hong Kong at this point, with like people covering tear gas things with like orange cones, right? So we're like, all right, revolt, people are revolting, cool. Not that Marxist Leninist approved of or supported the Hong Kong protesters or anything, but we looked at the yellow vest stuff and we're like, all right, these people are gaining momentum too, fight the austerity, sure. And then this sort of populist signifier shifts, and we see this freedom convoy thing, which is made up of some yellow vest people too, and it just goes to show, taken from the title of your article, The Perils of Left Populism, right? Like this unwieldy sort of improper universal signifier is beyond like you can't control that, like you can't control how this will shift, how it will manifest, and what it will turn into. So yeah, I everything you're saying about this stuff, I mean, like I said, I was searching for some sort of like delineation between populist movements, because I don't know if you let me ask you this, dude. Like if you had a communist, like if you had a friend or a comrade or whatever, right? And they said they're not a communist, they're a populist. What would you think about that that declaration then? I mean, would that raise some red flags or something?
Well, yeah, again, I think it's so portable a signifier, and hence the expediency. This is why people are counseling that we use it, that we rally to what is ultimately a more vaporous term of identification. If someone said that to me, I wouldn't automatically think of it as a red flag. I would just have to populate it with content, because it doesn't have any content. And that is, to me, the concerning thing about counseling this kind of very ambiguous political form, where I know people who would probably describe their politics as populist. I do, and I know them from various organizing contexts. I would trust their work to varying degrees. I don't think that populism is a sinister ideology. My reservations have to do with the fact that it isn't an ideology. It's a discursive form, but in a given society, in a given social formation, every empty form really has a kind of de facto social content.
Right. So tell me what you mean by, in your article you mentioned that like something about misinterpreting the phrase the massive, and you describe what that means, and I wonder if you could spell that out for listeners. What do you mean by the masses in a quantitative sense versus a qualitative sense?
Yeah. As I see it, the populist temptation with respect to the freedom convoy is to see a mass or a popular movement in the making. However inchoate or confused, and think, hey, that's our line. Socialism is for the masses, by the masses, and so on. That's true, but our politics isn't passively majoritarian. And let me pause for a second and say, this is the other problem, in my view, with Emmett Jackson's depiction of this movement as enormously successful. outflanking the left,
Mm-hmm.
and so on, which she has in common, I think, with a kind of social chauvinist peanut gallery on Twitch and so on, you know. But I really strenuously object to that narrative, you know, that this is an incredibly successful movement. This is a very small percentage of the trucking industry and a smaller portion of working people in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this demonstration does not metonymize the masses in any sense.
Right.
As my comrade Jay Watts pointed out the other day, I think he said that 14,000 people came to a rally for Palestine in Toronto last year.
Wow.
You know, so compare that to about 8,000 people storming Ottawa with the convoy that first weekend.
Right.
We shouldn't exaggerate the numerical mass of this event either, right? But what I wanted to point out in that demonstration that you're talking about in that little quip is that just as there's a relationship between, you know, the class for itself and the class in itself, you know, there will be a point at which a revolutionary situation arises and the merely numerically superior masses, which again, the truckers are simply not, assert a collective self-understanding, you know, that they're the subject of history, you know, which again, the truckers are not. But we can't look at the dumb numbers and say, wow, it's class power, or we'd have to start crediting every color revolution, every hockey riot, every stampede, every tailgate party with undue significance, you know?
Yeah. 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 That's really funny, man. I mean, it's like, I think it goes back to as well, like, you know, the emptiness of content to populism with the sort of in numbers that they've accumulated not being truly indicative of any sort of power or capability. It kind of goes back to this concept of not having a concept, right? Because as communists, we refer to objective, systematized theory of like materialist substance, right? And so I think part of the quantity versus quality is that, like, you know, like I for sure I'd rather take a comrade who studied Marx and Lenin and has like an objective sort of like viewpoint towards liberation versus like someone who is taking up individual grievances towards, like, I don't know, selective policy or efforts to try and correct some sort of parliamentary decision. One is clearly of more substance, and while the other is, you know, and I will tell you this. When I read your article, first of all, I read your article first, and so I thought it was wonderful. But then I was like, oh, let me go check out what Emma said, you know, and what are you specifically responding to? I should probably do that if I'm going to host Cam in a discussion, right? And I came up with 10 questions for you rather quickly. It was fine, and it's like I don't know, like 300 words or something, you know. I read Emma's stuff, and I wrote out like 1,500 words of different highlighted passages and seeing like sort of, so I wanted to commend you on how charitable you were towards her article, because I felt myself getting a little enraged over here just reading it. First of all, with that sort of assertion that like the right has outflanked the left and stuff, I think I wrote in my notes, I reject this premise in toto. And again, this goes back to like the metrics. What kind of metrics are we using, sort of thing, you know? But there are also points within this article that she sort of like contradicts herself to where, like, you know, like she's talking about, like, in terms of this quantity versus quality thing, you know, she says, like, instead of building an insular movement restricted to people who agree with each other, 93% of the time, the right has successfully tapped into widely held resentment and built a mass on-ramp for people with highly divergent views. And I mean, in just paragraphs before that, she acknowledged that those affiliated with the far right are nevertheless at the core of this movement. And they're organizing under the banner of rights and freedoms in order to tap into a more broadly held grievances and expand their base. So I wonder, like, if we could ask her, like, what are these highly divergent views you're speaking to? You know, like, and things like, I just, like, why would she be encouraging, like, are we supposed to praise this movement that's led by far right people and be in all their accomplishments while not taking into account the sort of material conditions and the support they have from the status quo? But at the end of the day, she's also like, yeah, we need to approach these people, and but yeah, their center is far right and nationalist. I mean, it's just so, like I said, I felt myself getting a little proletarian rage going on when I was reading this, and so I just, like I said, I wanted to say, I commend you on like how charitable you were to it, because this is part of the reason why I don't write responsive myself, because they would be a little have a little bit of vitriol contained in there. But you also say, like, it's no miracle that the right has been able to recruit from those predisposed to reaction by their objective position between warring classes. What did you mean by that? Or can you spell that out a bit for listeners?
Yeah, for sure. This is after a question that I asked and try to answer about the class composition of the convoy and many of its supporters. And a lot of people seem to think that this demonstration is noteworthy for the breadth of support that it's receiving. I think Emma Jackson's examples are like Rebel News, it's kind of, to Green Party environmentalist types, are all signing on.
Oh shit, they got Rebel News. Right.
They got surprise. But like a lot of these seemingly disparate voices, do in fact have a class location in common, right? So the anti-vaccine and the anti-mandate movement is overwhelmingly petit bourgeois, and that's meaningful information. Like, we can't just take people at face value, what particular sort of ideological subset of petty bourgeois class interests do you subscribe to personally? I think it's worth parsing with reference to the class location of the participants. That's small business owners, entrepreneurs, owner operators, like a large share of the truckers involved. I would want to put a slightly finer point on that than some people care to. The owner operator tag is a tricky one, because drivers can carry onerous debt on their vehicle. Many more are doing just fine, but it isn't without some differentiation, but these tend to be people who are hit the hardest by mandates, which truthfully do benefit the high bourgeoisie. Like I said, I think there's some legitimacy, if this weren't so euphemistic, to a criticism of the state's approach to the mandates. Get everyone back to shitty work post haste. No more emergency social wage. You can forget EI reform, forget vaccine apartheid, and our failed obligation to the COVAX program. Let's just intermittently ban travel from the third world as the virus mutates. It's a terribly simple panacea in its present form, So I think that there's legitimate criticisms of the mandate as it presently exists. But these protests actually don't begin to touch on any of that, by the way. Like, equity is not a pressing issue for this crew.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's not a proletarian uprising. It's a small business lobby on wheels, underwritten by some far right ideologists. You can follow the money if you wish. It's the middle class of which Marx writes.
Yeah.
Not the fictive middle class that all the politicians campaign towards, but a substantial margin of people whose class interest is objectively cleaved. They're capitalist on one side and working class on the other, and their fortunes tend to decline precipitously in a crisis. So the downwardly mobile petit bourgeoisie are typically quite reactionary in these moments. Their fates are more closely linked to those of the workers beneath them, but they are strongly identified with the master culture of the bourgeoisie, whether that takes a patriotic form or whatever affective attachment. They are in this really tricky structural position, and historically have tended to be the advance guard of fascism, bluntly.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I when I was reading her article, man, it's funny. I don't know, I got maybe 3-4 sentences in before I started writing a paragraph on stuff, but she talks about how she went to like a protest that had, I don't know, other truckers a couple of years back, like 2019 or something. And she said she encountered one of these protesters. I mean, it's an unfortunate situation. I can't imagine how scared she was in that situation to have like an actual person from the other side of a protest just yelling into her face, right? So like we all don't want to be caught in that situation. I understand. But she says the guy yelled at her like, well, Trudeau shouldn't be letting migrants in while I struggle to pay my bills. And she yelled back, I came here from Alberta and I hate Trudeau too. And then this guy froze and stared at her incredulously. And so I wrote that like what I gathered from this is that it's an unfortunate situation. She got cornered by someone from the other side of a protest, and it's a dangerous situation. It's unpredictable. So I don't want to blame her for finding a quick-witted way to establish common ground with this bigot that's yelling at her about Trudeau letting in migrants, right? But if we're being honest and thinking kind of dialectically with this anecdote, then we should notice and examine the reasons why she did not engage directly with this prejudice. Like, she could have responded by saying, well, migrants are fully human and worthy of dignity and rights. And of course, you may disagree with Trudeau as passionately as your ideological enemies disagree with him, sure. But those are very different reasons that must be dealt with and cannot be done away with by simply acknowledging you have a common enemy. Like, you wouldn't show up to an organizing space with a guy who's reactionary just because he hates Trudeau. And, and do you want to punch up next to a person who punches up for despicable reasons? So it is feasible the person she encountered was already punching up to the degree that their anger was largely directed at Trudeau for allowing migrants in. So I think she's right to say that, like, it's one problem with two very different destinations.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's a very well observed. I think that's a very well observed point, because she takes a shortcut there, and how does that, how do those shortcuts actually serve an emancipatory politics?
Yeah. There's a couple more questions here for you, brother. Like, so how does populism tempt us with a dangerous illusion that both right and left recruit from an identical discontent, and that we are speaking to the same fundamental interests, although like with different reasons?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess the idea that could tempt this thesis, is that the broad masses will benefit from socialism. Of course, this is true. We are for all. And at the moment, all are not for us. But populism is an effective means. So we need to understand that it isn't recruiting from objective circumstance as such. There's no unmediated access to the class. Populism essentially recruits from fantasy. And I think that this is hard to account for. And flatly, I just don't think most people who lionize the convoy have an adequate theory of ideology and its brutal real world effectivity. It's simply a mechanically substitutive and subjectively coddled account of race hatred, for example, that proposes to exchange some fact, or even worse, some reward for a customary scapegoat. Fascism also recruits from working class discontent. And we're never talking about an absolutely like unsorted or idealized working class. So there's loads of historical prejudice that all good organizing has to address. But there's another deception here too. It's a popular, and in fact, I think like bourgeois slander of the working class, that it's preponderantly comprised of racist white men. You know, most organized fascist movements have a petit bourgeois character and base. So in a sense, it may only be some relatively vaporous notion of populism as a left-right convergence that tricks leftists into seeing proto-fascists with different class interests as simply mistaken kin instead of class enemies, you know?
Yeah, I do think it's a little suspicious that like, sitting in New York and observing these things going on in Canada, there are an alarming amount of American comrades who have said that we must recruit out of this convoy, that we have to engage them, that we have to, and first of all, like, I think it's really suspicious of any sort of comrade that insists that we must go and do this, um, while neglecting maybe like the local bakery down the street that's on strike that deserves your solidarity, and you should be there, adhering to your principles and supporting them, right? Recentering the labor movement and current struggles happening with Amazon, with with Starbucks, with teachers unions, with, I mean, in the middle of like the biggest labor push that we have had in this generation, these fuck faces want to go like fucking recruit out of the convoy. And I'm like, maybe you just want to hang out and talk to fascists. Maybe you're attracted to that. Maybe you are confusing some class interests and see them as like confused kin, when it goes back to the qualitative versus quantitative thing. Like, we don't just accept anybody in organizing spaces, in political parties. And just as you hate Trudeau, or just as you don't like liberals, just as you have some overlap with their ideology, even in the most marginal senses, it doesn't make them like some sort of a strange kin that you just need to, like, I don't know, convince them of something to win over their class consciousness. I mean, like, the concept of like class consciousness and raising that is a heavy concept, because you're dealing with very heavily ideologically programmed individuals who, it's like, why would it be an acceptable strategy to go and convince anti-communists of communism, instead of just, I don't know, like finding some people that are already sympathetic to our cause, like some people that don't want to fucking murder you, some people that, but like, if that's your prerogative and you want to do that, like, it's weird. It's like Antifa social workers or something, that like, yeah, we're anti-fascist, but we're also out to like convert fascists or something. And it's just, it fucking drives me crazy, bro. And so I like, going back to your article, I know I went off a little bit of a rant here, but I, in sufficiently delineating these differences, I sincerely hope that this episode and our conversation, your article, and the things that you spelled out for us can reach some of these comrades in error, and convince them that, like, you might want to study the stuff a little more closely, because honestly, if you can't, living in the fucking heart of empire, if you can't pick out a fascist movement, if you can't pick out reactionaries, if you can't see this plainly for what it is on its face, then you need to reevaluate how much theory you've read, or what you've absorbed, or where your principles and loyalties and philosophical commitments lie at that point. Because yeah, I can't deal with it, man, and it's been annoying the shit out of me. And I've had some tweets that have caught on lately about this stuff. But I honestly have been thinking, like, what is this conversation supposed to be like? Like, people that would recruit out of the convoy, what is that conversation supposed to sound like? Like, is it like, hey, I noticed that you're interested in socialism for white people. Can I offer you perhaps socialism for non-white people as well? Or like, hey, I see that you are, I don't know, anti-Trudeau. Well, I'm also anti-Trudeau, and let me tell you why I'm. It's like, no, it's like there's not even relatable things that you could tell to these people that are already engaged in a sort of like, fervor that's going on anyway, right? Like, does anyone really think that these people are reachable in that respect? I mean, I just don't understand it, bro. And that's, I don't know, that's part of the reason why I wanted to talk to you about all this stuff, because so I think I've got two more questions here, but so you take one of Emma Jackson's lines from her article and you kind of rework it in your article. And Jackson wrote this sort of premise that I rejected in toto here. All right, so hang on. Let me just continue with this rant for one more thing here, man. Like, can you imagine?
I'm with you. I'm with you.
Can you imagine if, like, on January 6th, if like the Canadian Communist Party was like, hold up, guys, hold up, the baker's down the street and the labor movement's going on here. We got to put that on hold and we got to recruit out of the January 6th fucking rioters that believe in QAnon and shit like that. Like, what kind of a laughing stock would that be? So anyway, so in terms of like this Emma Jackson question, right? Emma Jackson wrote that the right is better than the left at meeting the people where they're at. Jesus fucking Christ, right? And you said the right is better than the left at recruiting from experience that is already interpreted to the right. Would you say a few words about that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pretty modest suggestion, ultimately, that we shouldn't flagellate ourselves for lack of popularity or plain spoken appeal in a world that's entirely organized for capital accumulation, where the irrationality of markets seems natural, where absolute competition is the social contract. Like, the right is better at rewarding selfishness with reasons, and those like us who propose an entirely different organization of the world just shouldn't draw conclusions from the fact that people don't like to be challenged, and the right-wing explanation of reality is hegemonic and not challenging. I could have put it in fewer words. I could have said, in a capitalist society, the right is already where people are at.
Sure.
Yeah.
Wow. All right. So last question here is one rather powerful thing that you mentioned that I wanted to ask you about by way of kind of rounding things out is we mustn't oppose one fantasy of strength with another. So can you tell us what in Jackson's article compelled you to write that and what you ultimately meant by that, please?
Yeah. Like I said, populism recruits from an appealing fantasy. And Jackson, in this article, sees the far right telling a more efficacious story than the left is presently offering. If that seems a fair characterization.
I think I actually stopped reading her article when she started talking about how the left needed to have a better story to it,
Story is the watchword, right? So she wants us to tell a better or more attractive story. And straight away, I'll say that the stories we tell will never be quite as powerful, quite as immediately powerful or intuitively powerful as the right, because our stories have to be true. In a pre-fascist moment, you have socialists trying to embolden workers based on the particulars of their employment and their situation, and it's terribly unglamorous. And then on the other side, you have fascists telling the economically depressed that they are in fact fallen gods, right. And having recourse to all kinds of strange mythological language and strange mystifications, so we can't go that route. We don't have every opportunity available to us because we're not opportunists, is something that I've been saying. So what, and then what kind of story is she telling in this article?
Right.
I think she's already exaggerating our meekness and division. How are we supposed to get fired up about that? I mean, for my part, I don't relate to Jackson's description of the scale or organization of the convoy. I think it's a stampede. It's a carnival. It's far less successful in numerical and disruptive terms, not to make a fetish of disruption, but it's far less successful in each of these terms than the solidarity blockades across Canada for the Wet'suwet'en Nation when they were being invaded by the RCMP on behalf of energy companies. That happened in early 2020. And we shouldn't forget, just because of the shocks to the supply chain that the COVID-19 shutdowns 2 months later brought about, we shouldn't forget how effective those demonstrations were. It really brought the colonial economy to a halt. Idle no more would be an important precedent in Canada for that sort of thing. If you were talking about Indigenous-led organizing, connecting cities across the country. I remember seeing huge snaking car caravans throughout Winnipeg, where I am, but Canada more generally, offering solidarity to the Indian farmers, last year. And those convoys were longer than the Freedom Convoy. So it's unnerving to see the far right emboldened, and it's worse to see them bankrolled. And it's disturbing, in fact, to see them borrowing these tactics from the left.
Sure.
I would strongly suggest, the Conservatives that convened war rooms to hasten into legislation all kinds of protection for critical infrastructure, to ban public protest. And this would have impacts on everyone from land defenders blocking railways to picket lines outside of people's own workplaces. The same people who wanted to curb public demonstration less than a year ago because of its demonstrable effectiveness are supporting the Freedom Convoy today. So if we're looking at the Freedom Convoy and saying, wow, it's so effective, yeah, it's a right-wing quotation of some of the tactics that we have been applying with great success in our broad solidarity movements for many, many years. So I don't feel any tactical envy whatsoever. And I'm certain that the broad left is not being outflanked, unless, that is, we want to burn bridges with all of organized labor, alienate every community we pass through, befriend nobody but the police, and make a lot of money doing it. That's the Freedom Convoy. If those were our goals, then the Freedom Convoy is the gold standard.
Sure.
But I think already Emma's counseling, telling a different, better story. And I read the article and I was like, well, why make a mantra of our weakness?
Sure.
This isn't the story that's going to move people.
Yeah.
So there's that sort of self-contradictory aspect too.
Yeah. I mean, I had a thought the other day that those on the left who would recruit from the trucker convoy are just as unimaginative as those truckers who, just a couple of years ago were getting mad about people blocking roads and now have proceeded to block roads off themselves, So yeah, I mean, I also wonder, where was this sort of hey, we need to recruit out of the trucker convoy? Why haven't we heard this I don't know, why aren't these same leftists asking things like, hey, we should recruit out of the Indian farmers uprising or something, right? It seems like that's another country with a different movement that's achieving results that but I didn't hear any sort of desire to recruit out of them or show solidarity with them in a lot of respects, So Yeah, it's a really shitty situation, and I appreciate your insights towards populism, the movement, how we should grade this movement in terms of like what metrics we're using to judge their accomplishments. But you're absolutely right. Like if we wanted to isolate every community we went through and make friends with no one except the police and accumulate some capital in the process, then sure, the freedom convoy, scare quotes up this whole time, is definitely the gold standard of that shit, man. So well, listen, Cam, I so appreciate you being on the show, and I appreciate everything you told us today, and I'm sure listeners will get a lot out of it as well. I want to extend an open invitation for you to come back on the show whenever you have other articles that you're working towards, or when they debut, or if you write a book or something like that. I'd love to talk to you about that stuff, man. And before we let you go, would you tell us where we can find you online, and what, if anything, can you tell us about any of your upcoming projects?
Yeah, certainly. You can follow me at Vanishing Signs on Twitter.com. I am also hard at work collecting essays for a forthcoming book on uh, literature and social space. That has a lot to do with experimental writing by gay men in the 1980s, mapping the AIDS epidemic
Oh, wow.
in tandem with the Cold War. It has to do with the capacity of experimental literature to sort of, how to say, uh, disclose something of the social totality and kind of map a pre-revolutionary latency of the city and its crowds. It collects a lot of writing and criticism that I've been doing for the past 5 or so years. So that's coming out from ARP Books in 2022, in May 2022. And otherwise, I would encourage everyone listening, if you are interested in this political sequence in Canada, to follow the Communist Party of Canada across our social media and look at some of our statements at communistparty.ca. And yeah, and don't be fooled.